I'm carrying on about James Boswell. So I was saying that the tender age of a baker's dozen of years, he matriculated at the University of Edinburgh, which was extraordinarily young even for that epoch. So he distinguished himself academically and getting an MA. The ancient Scottish universities do not award bachelor's degrees. A master's degree is the lowest they award, and you have to do 4 years. You can't get a degree after 3 years. In most universities in the United Kingdom, in most subjects, after 3 years, you're awarded a bachelor's degree. One thing about Scotland is it was more typical to complete your schooling at 17, then go to university, although these days they tend to do this thing called advanced higher, stay under school till 18. But nevertheless, because these days they typically finish school a year earlier than in England, your primary degree is 4 years, not 3. Anyhow, he'd taken one degree, and then he went on to the University of Glasgow and took another degree. But they were more or less mixing and matching whatever they wanted from classics, but through Latin, reading history, philosophy, and whatnot. At the University of Glasgow, he was taught by Adam Smith, as in father of the Wealth of Nations. So he was perhaps the foremost figure in the Scots Enlightenment at the time. Now, Scotland only had a population of about 1 million, so the intellectual world was absolutely tiny. So he's very lucky to sit at the feet of the man who's really the father of modern economics. And then he went on the Grand Tour, and that was for upper-class boys in the 18th century into the 19th century to travel from the United Kingdom to France, certainly spent time in Paris, perhaps a few cities of high culture, perhaps through some of southern Germany, not Berlin, through Switzerland into Italy, seeing ancient Roman sites or seeing anything say to the Renaissance, soaking up some culture, going to the opera, and if they were frolicsome, no doubt consorting with courtesans. If they were particularly audacious, sailing on to Greece, maybe even to Constantinople, as then they would have called Istanbul, not to look at Islamic sites so much, but Hellenistic ones, and occasionally Egypt. I don't think anyone in the early 18th century went to Egypt. Well, he's more like mid-18th century. So he came back from that. He'd met Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Rousseau was that Swiss philosopher resident in France who'd published Émile about this time, which was his treatise on how to bring up a child, saying that a child has inborn goodness, and we mustn't civilize this out of him or her and just let them do as they will. So he had a complete command of French, came back and was eventually admitted to the Faculty of Advocates. That's to say he became a lawyer in Scotland. So lawyers in Scotland are called advocates, so they're about speaking in court mainly, and solicitors, so they're mainly about office work. But despite his extraordinary academic prowess, he was only a mediocre advocate. He found it unfulfilling, considered a decidedly constipated occupation, and dropped out of that. He came to London, and in 1763, famously just off Covent Garden, he wandered into a bookshop where he made the acquaintance of Samuel Johnson. The two formed an instant rapport, and Samuel Johnson was to be his spiritual father. And he started spending about a month a year in London for the next 10 years or so, and when he did so, almost every waking moment was in the company of Samuel Johnson, usually living in a house across the square from Samuel Johnson. I shan't talk too much about Samuel Johnson just yet. So he'd spent some time at the University of Leiden as well in the Netherlands. Didn't speak Dutch, but everything was in Latin, so that was all right for him. He'd fallen in love with a young Dutch woman, but she had to turn down his proposal. He considered marrying a wealthy, youngish widow, but again, she rebuffed his overtures. So eventually he married one of his cousins. He had several children with her, but she was very loyal to him despite his numerous infidelities. He was a notorious philanderer, had a mistress, a couple of children with her, and was often engaging in relations with prostitutes, repeatedly picking up sexually transmitted diseases, but she stuck with him through thick and thin. So a troubled sort, and again, afflicted by the black dog intermittently throughout his life. He wrote these marvelously detailed journals of his travels through the Netherlands and various other countries, so he was capable of composing the most crystalline prose and liked to take down all Dr. Johnson's bon mots as well. Anyway, Johnson finally died at a fairly ripe old age for a man who hadn't really looked after his after his health, and was known for his enormous appetite. Then Johnson published in 1791 Boswell published his life of Johnson, which was incredibly detailed and very lively, and it was an instant hit and got him the literary fame that he'd long craved and made him quite a wealthy man. So his later house in Edinburgh was just down the street from Edinburgh Castle. There's a street in Edinburgh called the Royal Mile from Edinburgh Castle at the top of the hill, the volcano, and at the foot of it is Holyrood House Palace. But he lived just a few yards from the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle. That was not the house he was born in, but the one he was lived in later on. Previously, he'd been living in Blair's Land. That was the area just behind the former Scottish Parliament, which was later turned into a law court. Anyway, he died in 1795, still considered to be a very notable figure. But in the 1920s, someone from Yale University was rooting around the archives of Malahide Castle in Dublin and came across a treasure trove of his notebooks, letters and so on. And so from this epistolary evidence we know a great deal more about James Boswell, and it sparked a renewed interest in all his accomplishments. Anyway, that's James Boswell. I'm not sure where he's buried, in fact, but there we are. Toodaloo.